Hello everybody, it's Andrea, and I'm about to do something which may either be really good or a horrible disaster, and I don't know which. One of the things that gets in the way of me doing these podcasts is that they are a lot of work to set up, because I've been doing very image-oriented podcasts because I didn't like doing videos of me. But since I've started doing videos of me, I figure what the hey, and I'll try to do one where it's just me, but I'll also try to keep it brief. There have just been a few ideas that have been swirling around in my head. It was my day off. The day went wildly out of control, as my days off always do, so I didn't get to do all the prep work I usually do, but I had some ideas I wanted to run with. We had errands to run, speaking of running, and a lot of my best ideas come when I'm sitting in the car talking, and we're listening to Ben Shapiro and trading ideas back and forth, and then I make little cryptic notes on my phone and try to decipher them later. One of the things I wanted to talk about was a story at Red State about Tim Kaine inadvertently blurting out the truth about Virginia's gerrymandering scheme. I'm not going to take the time to upload this little snippet because it's, again, something that takes a while to do. But as you know, Virginia is basically trying to gerrymander out of existence its Republican votes. And Tim Kaine was on Fox News, and he was asked, why should 90% of Virginia's congressional delegation be Democrats when Kamala Harris only won the state by 5 points? And Kaine said, 90% of Virginians are not Democrats. That's true, but we need a congressional delegation that will stand up to Donald Trump's tyranny. In other words, we don't need representatives that represent Virginia. We need representatives who represent Democrats. It could not be said more clearly. And I believe he said more than that, but that's a little Greg Price summation. It made me think, well, actually it sent me down two little paths. For one thing, we talked about the fact that Virginia voters are about to get it good and hard. In the same way, the National Vote Compact, which Abigail Spanberger signed, it is completely antithetical to the Electoral College. It says that when enough sign on, no matter how the people of the state vote, if the majority of the people vote one way, that's how the state is voting. So if Virginia voters vote for a Democrat, but a Republican presidential candidate, whether J.D. Vance or my current favorite, Marco Rubio, gets the popular vote, then Virginia voters willy-nilly, that's where their Electoral College votes go. It is the antithesis of what the Founding Fathers intended. They were deeply, deeply suspicious of unfettered democracy. We are a representative democracy, and it was intended to make sure that states had a say. Not just the big blob, the mob had a say, but the actual states. So everything Virginia has done and plans to do is anti-democratic. The National Voter Compact is, I'm sure, unconstitutional. It'll have to be ripped apart if we have a serious Supreme Court. It shouldn't survive. But back to what Tim Kaine said. My friend said they're going to get it good and hard in Virginia. They're going to really come smashing into reality. And what I said is, yeah, they will, but we'll go down with them. And I suddenly had a perfect visual analogy. Today, as part of my early morning, before my day went out of control, I'm working on a sweater for my son, and it's a really cool sweater. Very simple, actually, when you look at it. No cabling, no multicolors except for what the yarn does. But behind the scenes, structurally very complicated. Lots of fun to knit. So I put on background TV, and I found on Amazon Prime 25 World War II era cartoons, mostly Warner Brothers, some Paramount Studios, some Popeye, some actually created by the military. So you could recognize Mel Blanc's voice in the Warner Brothers stuff, but it was actually created for the military. A lot of thoughts came watching those cartoons. One, they're funny and imaginative. Two, one of them basically had the dove of peace first trying to stop the farmyard animals from going full Nazi, and then realizing when they went full Nazi that peace can only come by fighting. It was a very good analogy for the fact that you don't want to do what Tacitus said of the Romans, or actually quoted a Celt saying of the Romans, they make a desert and call it peace. To be legitimate, sometimes you have to go to war for peace, and that was a very good one. It also reminded me of the fact that it's a lot easier to go to war when you have the institutions and most of the country behind you. Since Vietnam, not 50%, but always close to 50% of the people are anti-war. Sometimes it depends where you are in the war, and 100% of the institutions are against the war reflexively, except for when it was the Ukraine war, which would have no benefit for the US, and I'll get to that in a minute. But my visual for the people in Virginia about to get it good and hard and taking the rest with us. What we'd like to think is that when a state or city goes stupid, the pain is limited to them, and that the rest of us can run away from it. And I suddenly had this vision of Bugs Bunny on a gremlin plane, bedeviled plane during these World War II cartoons, running out the door of an airplane, not realizing that the plane was in flight because of the gremlin. And when he realized, he turns around in midair and runs back in. And that's what we Americans like to think would happen, that no matter how stupid one state or one city is, it will not affect us, even if they're running out into space. When they realize how stupid they've been, they can run back in. But what it really is, when they get really stupid, is that it's a roadrunner situation, where the roadrunner might be running on space with no problem, but Wile E. Coyote, he races off the cliff, and he suddenly realizes what's happening, and he scrambles around in the air, and he turns back to the cliff, and he plummets downward, at which point a boulder usually lands on top of him. That's what would have happened to us with the Joe Biden presidency and a Kamala presidency if we didn't have the absolute unique figure that is Donald Trump. Donald Trump is utterly unique, and they tried to destroy him in every way they could, and he came back and he assembled around him a very strong team, and they are delicately taking the boulder off of Americans, and they're going to try to lever us out of the canyon in which we're squished and helicopter us back to the cliff and hope that we've learned our lessons. Whether we have, I don't know. I certainly hope we have. The other thing I wanted to talk about was this whole anything's good as long as Democrats win. And it is about what is morality. And this is something you have to remember, I grew up in a home where morality was assumed but not spoken. My father had grown up in an Orthodox Jewish orphanage in Nazi Germany. He was very well grounded in Judaism. My mother grew up in a mixed upper class, sort of, just mixed upper class European marriage that broke up. She went to school in Tel Aviv, so she got a biblical education. They were traditionally moral people. They were very moral people, but not analytical people about their morals. Since they weren't practicing religion, they didn't think about the religious component of morals. So as I became more conservative, I had to think about it. And in 2006, when I was still writing for American Thinker on a volunteer basis under the name Bookworm, I wrote something called Economically Flexible Morality, and I have it on the screen in front of me. I'm actually impressed with what I wrote. This was 20 years ago, and it was triggered by the fact that we had watched a 2004 movie called Maria Full of Grace, and it was about a teenager from Colombia who smuggles drugs into America. And the San Francisco Chronicle reviewing it, and I'm quoting, "A Bonnie and Clyde moment when you find yourself rooting for the outlaw over the authorities comes a third of the way into Maria Full of Grace, a revelatory independent film whose moments of incredible sadness are offset by the same state of grace that blesses its astonishing title character." The title character is a young woman who worked in a rose factory in Colombia, got pregnant by a boyfriend she didn't respect, got offered a chance to smuggle drugs in her stomach to America and took it, and then saw someone die of the drugs and have her insides ripped out. So she hid with that woman's unwitting sister, and I don't remember how it ends. So a woman who dumped a job, dumped the father of her child, smuggled drugs into America, and rose above her life of crime. There you have it. And what I said in my essay, given that Chronicle review, which is I think what led to us seeing the movie, I wrote, given that the lead character is an unwed pregnant woman engaged in illegal conduct, I naively assumed that the state of grace to which the review refers was the moment in which Maria suddenly realizes that she is engaged in evil, immoral conduct, repents, and works to undo the wrongs in which she was involved. That didn't happen. And then after seeing the movie, I read the Roger Ebert review, and he talks about how, he gives a little rundown of the plot and how she dumps her loser boyfriend. Well, in fact, the loser boyfriend, the moment he learned she was pregnant, asked her to marry him. It was the only traditionally moral moment in the film. And what Roger Ebert wrote is, Maria is a victim of economic pressures, but she doesn't think like a victim. She has spunk and intelligence and can think on her feet, and the movie wisely avoids the usual cliches about the drug cartel and instead shows us a fairly shabby importing operation run by people more slack-jawed than evil. Here is a drug movie with no machine guns and no chases. It focuses on a human story, and in Catalina Sandino, Moreno finds a bright-eyed, charismatic actress who engages our sympathy. Well, she wasn't bright-eyed or charismatic. She was sullen and self-centered and self-serving and criminal. But for these reviewers, because she was economically in the down position, she was a winner. And this is how the left thinks. And I'm going back to Tim Kaine, which is winners and losers aren't picked by fairness or morality or process or economics. They're simply picked by political expedience. If you fit the Marxist template, you're a winner. If you're anti-American, you're a winner. If you're sexually weird, you're a winner. Because anything that is in opposition to America and traditional morality is by default morally good. And let me tell you, that's no way to run a country. So that was one of the things I was thinking of. Another thing that I sort of got stuck on and just wanted to finish up with was about the IRGC. I wrote an essay on April 19th, so on Sunday. The IRGC is pushing toward a Hiroshima moment, but Trump needs a non-Hiroshima solution. And the reason I got stuck on this is, again, because I've always thought, and this was an older thought than just becoming conservative, about the morality of the atom bomb. So I always like to say, I'm here because of the atom bomb. My mom and her aunt, complicated backstory, found themselves in Batavia, now Java, Indonesia, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and took over the entire Malayan Peninsula. My mom and her sister were Dutch citizens, and as civilians they ended up interned, and they were interned for the war. It was not a pretty internment. These were not slave labor camps, although they did work the people, and so I always joke that I'm closer to a slave than your average American black whose ancestors were last slaves in 1860, whereas my mother was doing some slave labor for the Japanese in 1944, 43, 42. And they weren't death camps. It was not a Holocaust. There were not gas chambers and crematories, but it was terrible. There was a very high attrition rate, starvation, tropical diseases. My mother, the woman in the bunk next to her, eventually expired of tuberculosis, and my mother thought she hadn't gotten it, but years later she discovered her lungs were all scarred. So she had gotten it, she just never knew. She also had 2 kinds of malaria, and malaria is a cyclical disease. You get fevers every 3rd or 4th day, and she had both tertiary malaria every third day, and then the one that you get every fourth day. So she was constantly having fevers, and she got beriberi from vitamin deprivation. When the atomic, and my aunt was doing no better, their camp commandant at Chideng was the only civilian camp commandant in the entire Malayan Peninsula area who was hanged for war crimes. You know, we always hear about what happened to the men, especially the soldiers, unlucky enough to be in Japanese camps, because the Japanese had no respect whatsoever for men who surrendered. So they were treated worse than bugs. I mean, this is like pulling the legs off bugs, and the Japanese did it with pleasure to humiliate the men, and you hear about the just horrible stuff. The Chideng was so bad. When the war ended very abruptly, my mom and my aunt had both lost interest in food. If you are starving to death, you are always hungry. When you stop being hungry, you have actively started dying. And the fact that the bomb dropped and the war ended gave them an interest in life again and brought them back to life. And they weren't the only ones. And thankfully, they weren't as far gone as the people in the German camps. In the German camps, even after the camps were liberated, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people still died from diseases and starvation that were too far gone to reverse. Anyway, so I've long thought about the morality of dropping the atom bomb, and I grew up in an era where it was considered an unrelieved evil, and I never thought it was an unrelieved evil. And so I'm going back to, for me, it was a good thing. And then in the late 80s, I read Paul Fussell? Yes, Paul Fussell, the Princeton historian, and he's written one. I'm sorry, I'm digressing like mad because all these thoughts are piling into my head. This is how my brain works and why I always have insomnia. He wrote a wonderful book called The Great War in Modern Memory about the literary side of World War I. It's also a history of World War I, but one of the things he makes a point about is it was an extraordinary literate war. We know about the famous war poets and writers, Robert Graves and Siegfried Sassoon and people like that. But he makes the point that even the most ordinary foot soldier knew his Shakespeare and his Bible, and so it was a tremendously literate war. It's a wonderful book, Great War and Modern Memory. But in 1988, he wrote an essay called Thank God for the Atom Bomb, and he articulated what I'd always known intuitively, which was that it was the right thing to do to end the war. Japan had started the war, and Japan fought with unparalleled ferocity because the Japanese Bushido ethos was no surrender under any circumstances. No surrender at all. Iwo Jima, I think they lost thousands of troops. I forget the number of dead or wounded, but it was staggering because even though the Japanese were losing, they were not French. There were no white flags. It is better to die and take down a couple of enemy soldiers than to surrender. When the War Department looked at the war to take on Japan, the mainland, the main island, what they figured out, Paul Fussell quoted someone who said it would take about, I'd have to look through, the numbers were insane because the Japanese expected every civilian man, woman, and child to fight. It was going to be a whole island effort. They knew that the Americans would win. I found after I wrote the article a PragerU video that just went up a few days ago about the fact that the Americans estimated 1 million casualties. 1 million military casualties. So dead, wounded, captured. It would have been an unbelievable fight, an insane loss level over what was thought to be a year, maybe a year and a half of war. That made, and it would have been the same in the Malayan Peninsula, although a smaller scale for the British. It made dropping the bomb a no-brainer because one of the moral understandings that they had at World War II is that your own people are more important than the enemy. If it comes to your people versus the enemy, you take out the enemy. Now, we no longer do Dresden-style bombings or Hiroshima or Nagasaki, where we deliberately target civilian centers. That was actually sort of something. Sherman's march through Georgia worked because he realized that as long as Southern citizens supported the Confederate Army, they too would never surrender. Sherman had to break the civilians. And that was kind of part of the thinking of what was still going on in World War II. You have to break the civilians. And we don't do that anymore. And it's been a problem for Israel. Israel brought down houses but didn't break the civilians in Gaza and for years. And even in the last war, Israel did its utmost to protect civilians. It was Hamas that put the civilians in the line of fire. So we try to protect civilians, and especially in this war, Trump has been doing his damnedest to protect the Persian people. I always use Persian, not Iranian, because the people want liberty and they want to be saved, but it's not going to happen until the mullahs and the IRGC are destroyed. And going back and forth between, I was flipping from one war to the next like crazy, but one of the things I want to talk about is whether the Persian people will be accepting of a certain attrition rate. I know that's a weird thing to say, but during World War II, the prisoners of war were happy, even though when they wanted their trains and factories to be bombed so that the Nazis would be destroyed. As long as the Nazis were not destroyed, they were going to the gas chambers, they were being worked to death, they were being tortured, they were being experimented on. The Nazis were going to be a power forever, an utterly malevolent, satanic, evil power forever. And people who are in utterly dire straits, Warsaw Ghetto, they'd rather die on their feet than live as slaves. So, and that gets to the point you could say, well, the IRGC would rather die on their feet than live as slaves. And that's true. You could even admire them for it, sort of Michael Moore style. But what you have to do is look at what drives the value system. For the left, as in that Maria full of grace, well, she was an economic down person, not an economic up person. Therefore, she was morally good, irrespective of her sullen personality, her careless pregnancy, her refusing to get married, her criminal conduct, her insensitivity to others. Because she was one down, she's good. But what really matters is who you are and what you're fighting for. The people in Persia and the people in Auschwitz who were prisoners who might have taken on some of their own casualties understood that they were opposed to a great evil. And they recognize that if you fight great evil, bad things will happen, but you have to destroy evil. But for the left, going back to Michael Moore and the 9/11 attack, when I don't remember the words, but it was basically saying, well, they were fighting for what they believed in when they killed 277 people in the towers and at the Pentagon. For the left, as long as you fight the U.S., you're good. That's their morality. As long as you're in the economic down position, you're good. As long as you're not Christian, you're good. This is also why they've become increasingly pagan. One of the things about the biblical God is a moral God. It's not situational morality. It's morality. And paganism is situational morality. That's why the biblical God ultimately created better societies. The pagans, it was placate this God, placate that God, placate this angry God, placate this capricious God, placate this God who blesses wooden ships and that God who blesses only horses. There's no morality, there's no moral compass. And I know I've wandered far afield of my point, to the point where I don't remember my point anymore. But the Hiroshima analogy is important because what Trump is fighting for is goodness, not perfection. We're humans, we're not perfect. But he is fighting for goodness against evil. And the first people he has to care for are the Americans. We are his people, and we deserve his care, and we deserve to be free from the specter of a nuclear Iran that has spent decades killing Americans and has promised that when it achieves nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, that it will indeed control the world and take out anyone it doesn't like. So that was my long riff. The one other thing I wanted to do was talk about another article I wrote, actually. I wrote, and I'm not going to summon it up, but what I wrote about was a very funny article at The Atlantic by a very gay, not gay, a queer identifying, whatever that means, a gay guy who worked for 10 months at the Trump Kennedy Center. And he was let go on March 26th after slow walking instructions to shut down exhibitions in preparation for shutting down the entire Trump Kennedy Center for much needed renovations. And he wrote about the utter horror of it all and how the Trumpistas are Philistines and how they're trying to make it commercial by getting sponsorship for exhibitions. And I thought, anyone who is throughout history, if you know history, very few artists were able to live just by selling to people who liked their art. Especially during the High Renaissance and the High Middle Ages, you got patrons and your art was for them. We, the taxpayers, are the patrons. And these art people don't recognize that he who pays the piper gets to call the tune. And we don't want them doing art celebrating weird sex and celebrating cultures other than America while denigrating American culture and ridiculing ordinary Americans and ridiculing the Bible. That's not what we want. And just today, what I found through Instapundit was an essay inside the feverish delusions of the professional arts class written by Jenny Holland, and it's called Saving Culture from Itself. And she talks about being at an arts event in Belfast where she lives, and it was entitled Working Against the Clampdown, Who's Afraid of the Arts? And it was, so what they did was so she was sitting in the audience with two friends of hers who have been kicked out of the arts world for daring to complain about transphobia. And she says, I listened to salaried grandees discussing the challenges they faced while existing off the largesse of the British taxpayer. It was an experience of cognitive dissonance so sharp it felt like a slap in the face. At the talk, local arts professionals, mostly administrators of nonprofit or lobby groups that oversee productions and events, earnestly and with considerable confidence praised themselves and the arts sector generally for being brave warriors against malign, reactionary, right-wing, and religious extremists. That there was another culture war being waged by them against many others, they seemed disconcertingly unaware of. So you can find this, there's more and it's very good. It's a Substack, and the first word in the Substack title is Jenny Holland. And Holland, like the country, Holland, all one word. It's a Substack. But that was exactly my sense of this pompous, self-satisfied git who knew much better than anybody else how the Trump Kennedy Center should be run, and it should be run by making the taxpayers pay for his decidedly non-traditional, and some might say perverse, ideology. Although, to give him one area of credit, he is deeply, deeply concerned by what happened on October 7th in Israel. I was unable to find what he thought of the Gaza war when Israel fought back. It must have been quite a tension for him given his politics versus being pro-Israel. I see that tension a lot now amongst people I know who are pro-Israel Democrats, as they're realizing that Tucker Carlson notwithstanding, Candace Owens notwithstanding, the beating heart of the Democrat Party is fiercely, almost genocidally anti-Semitic. Also, my friend reminded me, and I didn't look up the site, the quotation, but apparently Milei, the absolutely wonderful leader of Argentina, his comment about taxpayer dollars is if you're taking taxpayer dollars for your art, you're no longer an artist, you're a government employee. And on that note, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it hasn't been too terrifying seeing me without any art alongside, but it certainly made the whole thing a great deal easier. And on that note, goodbye. Have a great, until I talk to you next time. I'm, as always, very, very grateful about your paying attention and sticking around.